Good afternoon, and welcome to this stream, which we are going to be discussing meditation and contemplation in Golden Age Spanish Catholicism and its mystical traditions. I must say from the off that I wasn't planning to do this stream today, but I had all I can describe as a prompting to do this, and I'm really excited to explore how brothers and sisters in Christ in the past attempted to open themselves up to experience the love of God and to love God in their own spirituality. And I'm hoping that uh, over the next few months, I'll have the chance to explore multiple figures and traditions within Spanish Golden Age mysticism. Today, we're going to look at one of the earliest and most important in 16th century Spanish mysticism, the way of recollection. This this tradition had an influence on figures such as Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, for good and for ill. And we're going to explore how in this tradition there was a distinction between meditation and contemplation. And I think this is rather important, particularly today when there is a resurgent interest in spiritual practices, regardless of whether people are religious or not. Um, and with ideas such as mindfulness, emphasizing forms of meditation, to really define the distinction between these concepts and what these practices are about. Not only because that will help us to understand what people mean when they say meditation and contemplation, but also because, as these authors attest to, in their experience, it helped them to love God more fully and absolutely. And ultimately, that's more important than anything else. So before we get into these mystical traditions, I think it'd be worth going over some of the context in which the way of recollection was formed and articulated. In the late 15th century, there was dramatic changes in the Iberian Peninsula. In particular, there was the marriage and union of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. And with this, the two biggest kind of kingdoms within the Spanish peninsula were united. Now, they weren't formally united, they didn't become one country, but together, through the union of their two monarchs, they acted in tandem. They had a strong, more than an alliance. I suppose the closest you could get in comparison would be how Scotland and England shared a monarch when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. The two countries didn't formally join, but they shared a common ruler. And Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to create a Hispanic Catholic empire. They wanted to do this out of sincere piety. They believed that Catholicism was the true religion that needed to be enforced upon the world. And they also wanted to see their own people restored to glory. They wanted to unite Spain under this Spanish Empire. And so to do this, there was kind of two main strategies that they took. One was to purify the Iberian Peninsula and purge it of any so-called deviant elements. And these elements are religious and ethnic. They're bound together in this story. So we have to remember first that in medieval Spain, there was a multiplicity of kingdoms. There was Islamic kingdoms and Christian kingdoms. And this meant that much of the population was multicultural and multi-ethnic. There were Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Now, in these Christian countries, there were particular names for certain groups. So there were what were called conversos, which were Jews who had converted to Catholicism, and there were Moriscos, that were Muslims who had converted to Catholicism too. Now, much of the population, the old Christians, that is, Spanish Catholics, were deeply suspicious of conversos and Moriscos. They believed, and not without some reason, that many of these people had converted not out of true faith or love for God in Catholicism, but rather to escape persecution, and that these people were secretly still practicing Judaism and Islam and were trying to convert old Christians to Judaism and Islam. Such fears motivated Isabella and Ferdinand to, in 1478, request the make a special request to the papacy. They asked that the Pope would give a special dispensation to create an independent Inquisition for Spain. And this was to hunt out heresy amongst the conversos, to make sure that they weren't still practicing Judaism and trying to convert all Christians. And the Pope agreed. And this was really important because it meant the Spanish Inquisition came under the direct control of the Spanish monarchy. And this in itself points towards a broader point that over the 15th and 16th centuries, the papacy would concede many powers to Catholic monarchs in Spain because they were able to instantiate a thoroughly Catholic nation. And thus the king or the queen ultimately became a sort of quasi-papal figure or head of the church in a Spanish context, at least politically. So, and the Inquisition did carry out its purpose. For the majority of its early career, from 1480 to 1540, most of its cases dealt with conversos and punishing conversos. At the same time, it wasn't just about purging inwardly, it was also about expelling foreign or heretical governments. In other words, the Reconquista of Spain. And in 1492, the combined powers of Aragon and Castile defeated the Emirate of Granada. Granada fell, and this pushed out the last Islamic kingdom from Spain. The same year that Isabella expelled the Jews from Granada, with those who refusing to convert being forced out of Spain. 200,000 in total, and there would be future expulsions too. And fundamentally, this idea of purity of religion and blood was so enshrined in Spanish culture that there became an emphasis upon checking whether people had pure bloodlines before they could take roles within the church or public office. And this would be something that Teresa of Avila would have to navigate, as her grandfather had been a converso and her father had forged her documents saying that they had pure blood so that he could be a merchant in Avila. So you could see that there was a very strong emphasis on making sure that ethnically and thus religiously Spain was pure. However, it wasn't just about purging what was seen as the, I guess, disease of heresy and racial difference in Spain. It was also about trying to cultivate spirituality, make the Spanish people the most zealous adherents of Catholicism in the world. And this ties into in the resurgence of interest in spirituality in the late medieval era. Across Europe, there was a growing hunger and thirst for a more meaningful and deeper connection with God. We could see this in that there was an explosion in the number of relics which were bought and sold. Many collectors accumulating thousands of relics in their churches. There was an increase in the number of pilgrimages. And perhaps most significantly, there was an increase in people joining monastic orders. All of these things have been described by some scholars as intra-religious conversions. Now, to define this concept, we can contrast it with interreligious conversion. So, an interreligious conversion is when somebody converts from one religion to another. So, a Jew becoming a Catholic or a Catholic becoming a Muslim. This involves formal profession of the new doctrinal creeds, attending the appropriate rituals, and following a new external way of life primarily. By contrast, an interreligious conversion involves somebody already within a religion, but has an experience or a sequence of experiences which aims at growing closer to God. And this change could be marked by fundamental life-changing alterations, such as joining a monastery, or it could be manifested in trying to accumulate relics, and so on. In a Spanish context, one of the key outworkings of this was observant reform of the Franciscan order. In the 14th century, many Franciscans had become dissatisfied with the state of their monasteries. Unlike their founder, St. Francis, they lived in relative luxury, had good food, and spent little time in prayer and meditation. Or at least that was the criticism. And so there became a movement called the Observant Reform Movement, which aimed to restore Franciscan monasticism to its original principles of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These monks would actively seek isolation. They lived in hermitages outside of cities and towns. They wore poor clothing, lived in poor conditions in cells which were hard to stand or sleep in. And they dedicated their time to prayer and meditation, like their founder, St. Francis. And they developed their own mystical tradition or technique called the Way of Recollection, which we will come to in due course. Observant reform of the Spanish Franciscan order had key support from Ferdinand and Isabella, and crucially, Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros. Now, he was a really influential figure within Spanish Christianity and also politics. In 1492, he was appointed as Isabella's confessor. Remember, the same year that the Jews were expelled and Granada fell to the Catholics. In 1495, with Isabella's help, he became the Archbishop of Toledo, which was the de facto head of the Spanish Church. I guess like the Archbishop of Canterbury. He later became the Grand Inquisitor for the Spanish Inquisition, so the head of the Spanish Inquisition. He also became a cardinal, and he also acted as regent when Isabella died, and later when Ferdinand, after he had taken the throne from Isabella, when he died, Cisneros was also asked to be regent again. So this was someone with immense influence and respect amongst the Spanish elite. He even went so far as to lead his own crusade. In 1509, he wanted to lead a force against Oran, I should say, which is in Algeria. This was part of the expansion of the Hispanic Empire into North Africa, with Ferdinand leading his own campaigns around the same time. Nobody wanted to support Cisneros in his endeavor. He got no monetary support from the crown. He didn't get any militias drawn to him or given to him by the nobles. So he funded his own army to go to Oran, and they conquered it. So he's a very active figure, and he was also tying in with this Hispanic expansionism. Crucially, he was very supportive of democratizing mystical spirituality. He wanted to see the intra-religious conversion stimulated by Franciscan observant reform expanded to the laity. He had published many spiritual works in Castilian. so that ordinary people could read them and access them, such as the life of St. Catherine of Siena or the life of Christ by Rudolph of Saxony. He also supported Franciscan observant reform against the conventuals, who were those who opposed it, and so helped it to flourish within the Spanish context. By the 1520s and 30s, the Franciscan observant reform was well established, and the way of recollection they practiced had been widely disseminated amongst the population, or at least those who were deeply committed. And within this period, a number of texts emerged from those committed to this mode of spirituality, seeking to share it with the broader population, the Spanish population. There was three key individuals who attempted this. Francisco de Osuna, who was a friar, a Franciscan friar, Bernardo de Palma, Bernabe de Palma, who was a gardener, and Bernardino de Lereda, who was a physician of of national renown. Now, each of these wrote texts seeking to describe the mystical way of recollection, and in particular, as soon as the third spiritual alphabet was widely read and greatly disseminated across Spain. And it even influenced somebody like Teresa of Avila. She read Osuna and Laredo at various points in her life. Importantly, this mode of spirituality was not seeking to break away from older traditions, but rather developing off of medieval mystical traditions, was seeking to articulate a new brand of it for the modern Spanish age. We're going to look at, in particular, Laredo's Ascent of Mount Sion. He published this initially in 1535, but in 1538 he published a second edition which was greatly expanded upon the specifically mystical aspect or of union with God. And so we're going to look at that in particular, but many of the comments that he makes could be applied to Osuna and de Palma's understanding of the way of recollection too. It's representative. Laredo's work is divided into three parts, and these follow the classic divisions of mysticism within medieval Christianity, or the mystical path. The first part deals with what's often called the purgative way, and this is concerned with purging out of the soul those inordinate affections and desires which block us from having communion with God. In Western Christianity, the doctrine of original sin has a very important role. Following Adam's first sin in paradise, is not all human beings are corrupted or through descent from Adam receive original sin. And this has at least two key effects. One is that we bear the same guilt that he had. The second is that we are corrupted in our faculties. That is, we no longer love God in what we do. Instead, we are predisposed to hate God and do things which are sinful. We crave lustful things. We enjoy carnal loves instead of God. And so the purgative way is fundamentally about addressing this aspect of human nature. It's about trying to remove those evil desires from ourselves. For Laredo, this begins with sustained thought on our nature. First, as creatures, that we are limited, that we are not capable of all things, and that we receive our being from God. And second, on our sins. And it's not just our sin in general, but the particular sins that each of us have. or are predisposed to commit? What is it that fundamentally motivates us? What is it that drives our behavior? Laredo wants us to think about what those things are and meditate on the fact that we do these things. He wants us to accept that we are sinful. In so doing, this is supposed to purge these aspects from our nature. Or at least it prepares the way, because we've at least identified that A, we are dependent. We are creatures who are dependent on God. And two, we are sinners and we have X, Y, and Z sinful tendencies. The second part of the work is what's called the illuminative way. And this deals for Laredo meditating on the life of Christ. And typically, the illuminative way is, once we've purged ourselves of these inordinate desires and affections, illumination of our minds. We have faith. It's about building faith. And so it often, regardless of the tradition, focuses on the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, contemplate or meditating on this. Now, meditation has a very specific meaning within this context. Typically, it means some form of mental composition. It'll be really helpful to look at this through how Ignatius of Loyola, the author of the Spiritual Exercises and founder of the Jesuit Order or Society of Jesus, really defined it, because it was crucial to his spiritual exercises. In all of his exercises, or most of them, there's a certain pattern. Usually, each exercise deals with a particular biblical story to do with, in week 2, the life of Christ, in week 3, the passion of Christ, and week 4, the resurrection or ascension of Christ. It's a 4-week cycle, the first week being the purgative. So when we've got our biblical story, let's say it's the feeding of the 5,000. First, we must form a mental image of the place where this story takes place. So we're told in one of the stories it's Bethsaida. So we would try and form in our minds an image of this. And it's not just how we see it. For Ignatius, it has to involve all of our senses. So we have to imagine how it looks, what we hear, what we smell, what we touch, and so on. In so doing, we recreate the context in which this biblical story took place. Then we have to do the same with the characters in the story. So in this story of the feeding of 5,000, we've got Jesus, we've got the 12 disciples, we have the larger group of disciples, and then we have the 5,000 people sitting, listening to Jesus. We have to imagine them in all their fullness. Then we have to observe and consider what each of the characters say. So, for example, we have to think about and imagine the disciples saying, well, Jesus, look, these people don't have food. We then have to imagine Jesus's response about, what did they have? What food do you have? And then giving the blessing over this food, and then the miracle taking place. We have to imagine those things happening. And I've kind of jumped ahead here, but following imagining what they've said, we then have to imagine what they do. And in this practice of meditation, where we're meditating upon these events in such a visceral way, we're supposed to create within ourselves, or stimulate within ourselves, a sympathy with the characters in the story and what they do. We're supposed to be able to get into the mindset or the motivations and experiences of those characters. So, for example, if we are the little boy who brings the fish, there is a little boy in the story of the 5,000 who brings fish to the disciples. Well, we can imagine his experience in this story. Through doing so, we come to have a new understanding of what the biblical message is of Jesus Christ. We get to see in a new way the activity of God incarnate, and this is supposed to bring or stimulate more love for God and deeper faith. These ideas were integral to the new form of painting which emerged during this period, the Baroque style. And in particular, if we think about Carracci or Caravaggio's, the two kind of main styles in Italy they represent, both of them focus on moments within biblical stories, and they seek to present their characters, whether in an idealized form or not, in a real way. They look like real people in with a snapshot. It's a snapshot of a biblical story, and often there are attendant figures watching or taking part, displaying different reactions to what's going on in the story. This is all to help us meditate. We're getting a visceral representation that we can use to imagine what it was like in this story, and using the reactions of those in such a painting, we can ourselves imagine how these characters experienced it. So these paintings were often used for meditation, and we see it also in common devotional books of the period that an image might be included. And as the picture I used for advertising this video kind of indicates, it's a picture of Saint Francis meditating in front of a crucifix. So these objects, such as Christ crucified on a cross, in the medieval Catholic tradition, there's very visceral representations of Christ on the cross in many churches. These help us to meditate upon the story because they give us a sensory picture of what it was like that we can then use to stimulate our imaginations. So meditation is a discursive and imaginative and creative activity aimed at recreating in our minds the stories of the Bible or picturing various doctrines, such as in Ignatius's spiritual exercises, we are called to imagine hell and smell the smoke, feel the heat of the flames, and so on. And in so doing, this is to stir within us various appropriate emotions. For Laredo, he has a slightly different twist on this. He argued that we should meditate on the life of Christ and imagine that these things that we meditate upon are happening within our very souls. Our heart is the ground upon which the cross is erected, as it were. And thus we are to apply in our very souls the meaning of these biblical narratives. So again, it's a discursive activity. It's one we have to consciously think about and apply ideas from other contexts into our souls. We then move to the third and final part of the work, the unitive way. And this is probably the most interesting part of the work, or most distinctive. Laredo argues that at a certain point, it could be a few weeks, it could be many years, the illuminative way ceases to be of value to the mystic. It's not because there isn't value in it. As he says, it's a good way of stirring up love for God, knowledge of the of Christianity and its teachings, and so on. But the problem with this way is that it doesn't lead to a direct experience of God. And thus the soul, having gained more love for God, more knowledge of Christian truth, desires a direct experience of God. It wants God first and foremost, beyond just understanding. Thus, what's needed is what Laredo calls pure contemplation. And pure contemplation is almost the exact opposite of meditation in many ways. He describes it as the silence of understanding, the serenity of memory, the quietness of will. It is both physical and inner silence. Remember that these Franciscan monks would live in hermitages outside of cities, and towns in the countryside, so they're in solitude. They would live in their own individual cells, often practicing total silence during the day, except for Bible readings. There's absolute silence. There's nothing to stimulate them through their senses, but they are also to silence their inner faculties too. As Laredo says, there should not be a single thought exciting the conscience or the consciousness. Nothing should be allowed to do it. We have to still our flights of fancy, our imaginations, so that there is just pure nothingness, pure silence in the soul. Thus, contemplation is for Laredo and the opposite of meditation. Whereas in meditation, we have to actively imagine things. In contemplation, we have to actively still and silence our imaginations. As soon as we have a thought, we have to crush it. As soon as we have an urge to think about something or imagine something, we have to get rid of it. And this is what he calls the act of recollection. We're collecting up all of our powers, our inner powers, and putting them, as it were, to sleep. Now, why does this very drastic action of self-negation, we might say, of kind of removing our understanding and our memory and our imaginations, how does that get us closer to a direct experience of God? Well, there are at least two reasons, one that he explicitly states, and one which is assumed by these mystical traditions. And the first can be understood if we look at the concept or the idea of apophatic theology. So, apophatic theology is often contrasted with cataphatic theology. Well, cataphatic theology is a kind of theology which assumes that we can make positive statements about God. And by positive, I don't mean like uh, happy statements. I mean, we can say something about God's nature in a strong way. So, for example, I could say, God is good. There, I'm saying God, the subject, has the predicate is good. Or perhaps I could say God is all powerful. I'm saying something positive about God as a being, let's say. Apophatic theology, however, denies that we can do this. It begins from the point that God is not like anything else. God is not one more thing within the world. This is because God is not a creature. God is the creator of all things. Thus, there is automatically a categorical difference between God and everything else. All other things, having been created by God, belong in a different sphere of reality. Indeed, Aquinas would go as far as to say that the difference is God is being and all creatures are non-being by comparison, if we can even make comparisons. Indeed, this divide means that God is, in God's essence, incomprehensible. Our faculties of understanding are geared towards creatureliness. We can only understand things through for example, according to space and time. We can only imagine beings which exist in space and time. At least that's what David Hume thought. Our experience is of creatures through our sensory experience, I should say, is of creatures, and thus we can only imagine via such things. And this means that God, who is not a creature, who is not in space and time, doesn't fit into any of our mental concepts. Thus, the apophatic tradition suggests that we can only speak of God through negation. That is, we can only say what God is not like. So, for example, if I say God is infinite, what's really being said there is God is not finite. That's why when people try and apply modern mathematical understandings of infinity to God, they're missing the point of that phrase. If I say that God is omnipotent, I'm saying that God is not restricted by any creaturely limitation. At least that's how it was understood, I think, in the kind of apophatic tradition. And so on. We can make these sorts of claims about God because we can't comprehend what God is in God's self. Thus, when we come to something like meditation for Laredo, its problem is that it deals with creaturely realities. We have to imagine in our minds a sensory experience of Christ incarnate. And Christ incarnate is his humanity. We also have to imagine other things too. But all of these things are imaginations of creatures. At best, they can only mediate the divine reality. We cannot directly experience God through any of them because God is not a creature. Thus, meditation cannot be the way to direct experience of God. We need to remove the creatureliness from our relationship with God, and thus meditation must be put to the side. And indeed, every thought, every imagination must be put to the side, because for Laredo, these are always of creatures. Our concepts always deal with the creaturely, and thus, as soon as we have a thought, there's something in the way of God's direct essence, as it were. The second and unstated reason for doing away with meditation for Laredo deals with the metaphysics at its most fundamental. Aristotle argued that in every change there is an agent and a subject, and this subject would often be called a patient. The agent acts upon the subject to change it, either removing one of its powers or activating one of its powers in some way. So, for example, a craftsman is the agent on marble and through his actions creates a marble statue. Let's say the marble statue in this case is passive. It is acted upon by the agent of change. For Laredo, meditation is a form of activity. It's mental activity. And it's the soul acting in a particular way. And this would be true of any thought, of any imagination, and so on. We're doing something. Our minds are doing something. However, if we are to have a direct experience of God, we need to be in a state of passivity. We need to be free of action so that God can act upon us. Thus, I think implicit in Laredo's idea, mystical theology, is the idea that we need to get to a state of complete passivity so that God can act upon us and we can thus experience him. Consequently, we need to still all of our activity. And to do that, we need to close off any thoughts, any memories, any imaginations. Because if we don't, then our minds and our souls will be active and not purely passive, allowing for God to act upon us. So these are the two key reasons why for Laredo we need to move away from meditation at a certain point to experience union with God. Now, contemplation achieves this because, first and foremost, it does away with all of our thinking. It silences our intellect by recollecting it. Remember, it's recalling all of our thoughts and memories and so on to such a point that we no longer have any conscious thoughts, we no longer have any conscious memories, no imaginations are going on. Thus, we have done away with the thing which blocks us from experiencing God, both because creatureliness gets in the way, but also because we've become completely passive. We are just left in a state of presentness or attentiveness to the present. And we are like a vacuum waiting to be filled. So when we've achieved this state of pure contemplation through the way of recollection, we are then open to God's influence. And for Laredo, when we've reached this point, God's love stirs within us our will. Now, in his view, the will is distinct from the understanding, and it's something like a disposition, at least in medieval Christianity, a disposition to feel and act in a certain way. God's love enters us and thus stirs our love for God in turn. Then those two loves bind together. They intermingle, they mix, they embrace one another. And this is the experience of union with God. This experience we are conscious of, but because our understanding is silenced, we do not, and God is incomprehensible in his essence and modes of operating, we cannot understand how this is happening, or indeed truly what is fully going on. But we have an awareness that we are in communion with God, but only in the sense that we are presently experiencing it. It's a full attentiveness to the moment in loving God. And this union with God is one of extreme ecstatic joy. It is overwhelmingly powerful, and it is the highest point in the spiritual life. And so the goal of the mystical path is to reach this pure contemplation, which allows God to enter into the soul and change it and unite with it. Laredo's understanding of the path of the mystical path is quite similar to the late medieval concept of salvation. There was two main schools within Catholicism during this period. There was the old way, the Via Antiqua, which relied on the Aquinas's and Scotus's theology, and the new way, the Via Moderna, which relied on William of Ockham and Gabriel Biel and theologians like that. And this was the dominant understanding of salvation during this period. Essentially, these theologians, Ockham and Biel, argued that God had made a pact with humanity, a covenant, if as it were. And this pact set out the conditions for salvation. God had decided that if somebody does their best or does what is in them, then God will give them grace. He will reward them with grace and carry them on through to salvation. What a person does isn't of itself meritorious, It's just God will count it as meritorious. And so this pact underlay much of late medieval Catholicism. It's implicit in the sacrament of penance as it was practiced. A penitent would have to come to the church and confess to a priest. And they would have to convince the priest, at least given the changes to confession during this period, they would confess to a priest and they would have to convince them that they were truly sorry, that they had contrition for what they had done, and that they desired to make amends. And the priest would absolve them if he felt the priest would absolve them on behalf of God if he felt that they were truly contrite. That is, they had done their best. At that point, God's grace meets them and they are forgiven. So this kind of mystical path truly relies on this idea that we have to prepare ourselves, do our best, reach a certain point by reaching a point of pure passivity, and then God will enter in and unite with us. Now, there are at least two interesting criticisms of this approach that I think it's worth discussing at this point and may come up in possible future streams. One of them was alleged by Teresa of Avila. Teresa had read as soon as the third spiritual alphabet by the time that she wrote her famous life. And later on, she would read Loredo's Ascent of Mount Sion. So she was well aware of the way of recollection, and indeed she attempted to perform the way of recollection or practice it. But she found that she ran into great difficulty with it. And she gave at least two reasons for this. The first, rather tongue in cheek, was that she was a woman. Teresa suggested, somewhat mischievously, that because she was a weak, ignorant woman, she was unable to truly silence her faculties and was unable to do something so high and mighty as Asuna had recommended. And in doing so, she was tapping into quite common attitudes towards gender during this period, and at the same time highlighting to her reader that she wasn't trying to get above her womanly station. However, she has a much more interesting criticism to make of the way of recollection, which is that it assumes that God will act if one prepares in a certain way. As we've just discussed with the Pactum, there's the idea that God has made a promise that if one does X, if one does their best, God will give them grace. In the same way, Asuna, Laredo, and co., they all assume that if one gets to pure contemplation, God will meet you at that point. Teresa's point is that's not true, at least not in her experience. When she tried, when she did still her faculties, God did not meet her. And this points to something more fundamental about God. God is not like a vending machine that if you put the right amount in, you get something back. God is active. God is an agent. God is uncontrollable in that way. And it's up to God whether God gives somebody those direct experiences that they crave or not. There's no formula for getting them. It's purely a gift from God in her view. As such, Laredo is fundamentally wrong in thinking that if we reach a certain point, we will achieve union with God. Because for Teresa of Avila and later Teresa of Jesus, it's up to God whether we get this experience or not. So, the task for the nun or monk in her view is to continue in our meditative practices, continue in them, praying in them, not necessarily expecting that we will get an answer, but waiting in these practices until God decides to act. And that's very much her experience, that it wasn't out of some degree of perfection that she had reached that God gave her various experiences. Rather, these experiences interrupted her prayer life and came like thunderbolts into her mysticism. I suppose a second criticism, which maybe we'll explore in a future stream too, is this idea of the vacuum that is left open. One of the dangers with this is that if one is left purely empty, with no guards, just purely passive, well, God is one supernatural agent, but there are others, and not all of them are good. Indeed, some are quite diabolical. In this era, there was a real fear that the devil could possess you, that he could act upon your soul in malevolent ways, and indeed even simulate experiences of God, but twist them so that they would point you towards the demonic and away from God. There was genuine fear that if you empty yourself as a vacuum, you're leaving yourself open not only to God, but to the devil as well. And so, what safeguards are there is an interesting question. It's probably something that not many people today would be worried about when they entered into contemplation. But certainly for a 16th century Spanish Catholic, the threat of the devil entering you when you had prepared yourself for God was very real. A third criticism, perhaps, or challenge to the way of recollection, is again we could look at Teresa of Avila. In her emphasis upon the effects of union with God, or what the content of union with God is, I should say. And this comes really from the mature Teresa in her interior castle. In the interior castle, Teresa develops perhaps her most systematic account of the mystical path. It's certainly more structured than the life, which she wrote much earlier. And in the life, for her, it's really ecstatic experience of God is the highest point in the spiritual life. And you can see that that's very similar to what Laredo described. It's union with God in pure love, beyond understanding. By the interior castle, however, there's been a shift in what she understands the true content of union with God to be. And this is the highest stage for her in the spiritual life, what she calls the seventh mansion, or the very center of the soul where God dwells. And this is simply loving God absolutely. There may be divine ecstasies and raptures and flights of the soul, but these are no longer as prominent as they are in previous stages for Teresa. Rather, the soul is now in a state where it loves God above all else. It does not care for its own spiritual status, does not care for things in the world above God, and is willing to undergo much suffering, indeed with joy, to do God's will. In other words, it's just a pure love for God. No frills. It's just loving God. And this is in contrast. And well, this was a good way for her to defend her orthodoxy, because during this time there was much suspicion over female mystics. Some were thought to be diabolically possessed, as we've somewhat alluded to. Others were caught simulating their spirituality. So there was a woman in 1482, her name escapes me, I'm afraid, But she claimed to have stigmata and various revelations. But when the Inquisition caught up with her, it was found that her stigmata washed off when they scrubbed her hands with soapy water. And for Teresa, the way we can distinguish the false mystic from the true is that their mysticism results in love for God, in humility of oneself, and a willingness to love other people as an expression of our love for God. Thus, the effects of union with God must manifest in charitable living. And while Laredo and Asuna would agree that the effects of pure contemplation are the cultivation of virtue and right living, there is a fundamental difference between their view and Teresa's, because for them, charitable living is the effect of uh, pure contemplation. But pure contemplation is itself the highest stage or the highest state in the mystical life. Whereas for Teresa of Avila, at least by the interior castle, it is that charitable living, it is that love for God, which is the content of union with God. The ecstasies and so on are not the highest stage. So those are three challenges that could be put to the way of recollection. But nevertheless, I think there's great value in the way of recollection for a few reasons. One is that it recognizes the incomprehensibility of God and God's distinction from all created things. Indeed, they would go so far as to say even the humanity of Christ. This, I think, is for me has been really helpful because I'm somebody who's grown up and learned a lot about theology and I have a good understanding of theology, or at least of the Reformed tradition. But the danger has always been sliding into a kind of faith in doctrine, as it were, a faith in the beliefs of the religion, and closing off to anything that's outside of those kind of decrees or the creeds. But the way of recollection has kind of made me reflect upon the fact that God is um, beyond any creaturely definition or presentation or mediation. And so there always has to be a degree of openness to the reality of God, which cannot be conceptualized or brought down. And so being willing to put aside those preconceptions of who God is and what God is like is, I found, very helpful. I think it's also helpful, just as a pure point of distinction between meditation and contemplation, and being more clear in what kinds of spiritual practice we can engage in. Often, meditation and contemplation are thought of as the same thing. And perhaps in other traditions, they are just the same thing. But at least we can see we can define one as a very discursive practice. And there is also another practice, which is the absence of discursiveness in our minds. And finally, I just find it very moving that these men and women sought to find a way to experience God more fully and to love God more fully. And that they thought, regardless of their differences, whether it be between Asuna and Teresa of Avila, for example, in their concept of the mystical path, that fundamentally what they wanted was to love God more and more and more. And that these different ways of approaching God were just a means to do that. Ultimately, they shared the same goal. And I think that's really quite beautiful. Indeed, especially what their goal was. That is the love of God. So that's a kind of brief summary of the way of recollection and some of its stronger points and weaknesses. Just going to give a few minutes in case anybody has any questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to just give you a wee rundown of what I hope to do with the channel in the next few months. So I've been teaching a course this year on emotion, spirituality, and mysticism in early modern Christianity, which is where I've got a lot of this information from. And this is just a small snippet of the course. It's been really enjoyable to learn about. And one of the great things about it is that I've come across a lot of things that I can't include in the course, but are worth discussing in some detail. So over the next couple of months, I'm going to do a mixture of things. In terms of the Spanish Catholic mystical tradition, I'm going to primarily do live streams on those, and that might include figures like Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa of Avila, maybe John of the Cross, and also other groups within Spanish mysticism, such as the rise in Beatas, those holy women, holy female visionaries, and also De Ayamentio, the way of abandonment. So we might look at some of these things. At the same time, I want to produce a few videos on groups forming in the English Civil Wars, radical religious groups, particularly the Levellers, the Diggers, and the Quakers, not least because many of these movements had political ideas which were well before their time and were almost like dropping charges that would explode into culture later. So, for example, to give you a sneak preview, the Levellers, 40 to 50 years before John Locke, were articulating the principles of classical liberalism. The Diggers were hundreds of years before Karl Marx, essentially advocating for communism, while the Quakers were, as we know, have had a fundamental impact upon Western culture. They were advocating various ideas, such as the equality of all classes and genders, well before most people. Indeed, these three groups were very radical for their time, challenging the basic assumptions of most people. So I hope to do some shorter videos on at least those three groups. The videos will be all spread out just because work's quite busy, and I can't commit to being very constant, but that's my plan for the next few months, maybe into the new year, of doing a mixture of these live streams and these shorter videos here and then. But it doesn't seem like anybody's got any questions or comments. So with that, I'm just going to wish you a fantastic Sunday. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time and that you've tuned in. And I hope that you've taken something away from the Way of Recollection. And feel free to put your comments in below about what you think. I'd be very interested to know. God bless.